Have you ever experienced a dream so vivid, so visceral, that you couldn't tell if you were awake or still lost within the nightmare? I'm Lysander Corwin, an underwater archaeologist whose fascination for forgotten ruins has taken me to places I wish I could erase from my memory. Today, I'm going to share with you a tale that began with a dream, or maybe it was a warning. A dream of a drowned village, submerged in murky depths, where the whispers of those long-lost still echoed beneath the water. It was a nightmare that felt as real as my own breath, and as much as I wanted to dismiss it, its grip on my mind tightened, dragging me into a mystery that even now chills me to the core. It all started on a quiet night, the kind of night when the world feels too still, as if the darkness itself is watching, waiting for something to unfold. As soon as I drifted off to sleep, I found myself standing at the edge of a lake, shrouded in an unnatural mist. There was something unsettling about the silence. No birds, no insects, just the slow, rhythmic sound of water lapping at unseen shores. I looked down, and beneath the black water, I saw shapes, rooftops, twisted fences, and crumbling chimneys, like the skeletal remains of a forgotten town swallowed by the abyss. The air was cold and damp, and with each breath, I could taste the metallic tang of decay, as if the lake exhaled its rot into my lungs. Suddenly, I felt the undeniable presence of someone, or something, watching me. The hair on my neck stood on end, and I could feel eyes on my back, though when I turned, there was nothing but shadows and fog. The fear was palpable, a gnawing terror that made my stomach twist. My instinct screamed for me to wake up, to open my eyes, and escape the suffocating dread. But I was trapped, held in place by an invisible force. The water rippled, and I saw movement, a figure, pale and featureless, drifting just beneath the surface. It raised its hand, reaching towards me, and in that instant, my heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst. But there was something else, something worse than the figure beneath the water. A sound, faint at first, like a distant murmur. Then it grew louder, more insistent, a chorus of whispers, voices entangled, speaking words I couldn't understand. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the water, from the mist, from the very earth beneath my feet. The whispers carried with them a sense of sorrow, of longing, as if the souls of those who had perished in the village were calling out to me, begging for something I could not comprehend. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot, and a chill spread through me, starting from my feet and rising until my entire body was frozen. The figure beneath the water moved closer, its face inches from the surface, and I could see its eyes, dark, empty voids that seemed to pull me in, promising secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and I felt a single tear roll down my cheek, though I didn't know why. Was it fear, sorrow, or was it the realization that, deep down, some part of me knew this wasn't just a dream? Before we dive further into this terrifying journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. The stories I share here are not for the faint of heart. They're for those who dare to explore the unknown, to stare into the abyss even when it stares back. What I'm about to reveal is only the beginning, and trust me, the nightmare is far from over. It started with an ordinary night. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet, as soon as I drifted into sleep, I was transported somewhere else. I found myself standing at the edge of a vast, dark lake. The mist was thick, hanging heavily in the air, almost as if it had a mind of its own, wrapping itself around me like cold, clammy fingers. Across the surface of the lake, I could see rooftops just barely breaking through the water. A submerged village, its skeletal remains hinting at the lives once lived there. The silence was profound, oppressive, and I realized with growing dread that there were no sounds of nature, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the hollow stillness that seemed to swallow every noise. I stepped forward, and as my foot touched the wet ground, the sensation was unsettling, a thick, mud-like texture, almost as if the earth itself was trying to pull me under. The air smelled of mildew, old and damp, mixed with the sickly sweetness of decay, like something long dead resting just beneath the surface. My heart began to race, an inexplicable sense of familiarity washing over me. It was a déjà vu that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. How could I know this place? How could it feel so eerily familiar, like a forgotten memory that had resurfaced from the darkest corners of my mind? As I ventured closer to the water, a faint sound reached my ears, a soft, rhythmic dripping echoing through the mist. It came from somewhere within the village, and with each step, it grew louder, more insistent. The further I walked, the heavier the air became, pressing down on me, as though the very atmosphere wanted me to turn back. But something urged me on, a strange compulsion, as if I was being drawn in, unable to resist. Shadows seemed to shift at the edge of my vision, figures flickering and disappearing when I tried to focus on them. I began to feel as though I wasn't alone, that somewhere in the depths of those waters, something was watching. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. Among the half-submerged structures, there was a light, a faint, flickering glow emanating from what looked like a crumbling old house. It was out of place, an unnatural warmth in the cold, desolate landscape. I knew I should have stayed away, but my feet moved of their own accord, carrying me forward. As I approached, the light swayed, like a lantern caught in the breeze, casting dancing shadows on the waterlogged walls. I could hear a faint whisper, words that seemed to come from inside the house, though they were muffled, distorted, like they were being spoken underwater. I reached the threshold, and the door, rotten and swollen from years of neglect, creaked open as if inviting me in. My heart pounded in my chest, a primal fear clawing at my insides, warning me not to enter. But I stepped inside, and immediately the air changed. It was colder, the dampness clinging to my skin, and the whispering grew louder. I could hear it clearly now, countless voices, speaking over one another in a language I didn't understand, each one filled with pain and desperation. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I realized I was holding my breath, terrified of what I might see. In the corner of the room, there was a mirror, cracked and covered in grime, yet something moved behind the glass. I stepped closer, my reflection barely visible through the dirt, and as I peered into it, I saw not just myself, but another figure, standing behind me. It was a woman, her face pale, her hair drifting as if she were underwater. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pierce through me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but the room was empty. The whisper stopped, the silence deafening, and in that moment, I knew. I was not dreaming. This place, this village beneath the lake, was something far more than just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and whatever inhabited had noticed me. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, and I stumbled backward, my eyes fixed on the mirror. The woman was still there, her hand now pressed against the glass, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak. But no sound came out, only the echo of the dripping water and my own ragged breaths. I knew I had to leave, to wake up, but my body felt heavy, rooted in place. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was her eyes, those empty, endless eyes, drawing me in, drowning me in the depths of their despair. As I ventured deeper into the drowned village, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The mist thickened, swirling around me like a living entity, obscuring my vision and isolating me in a world where only the lake and its haunted ruins existed. The buildings loomed around me, their skeletal frames barely standing, twisted and broken by the weight of the water that had consumed them. Shadows seemed to move just beyond my line of sight, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that many eyes were following my every step. I began to explore the narrow streets, and as I did, I realized the village wasn't just abandoned. It was as if time had frozen. Rusted bicycles leaned against crumbling walls, doors hung loosely on their hinges, and windows were shattered, their shards scattered on the ground. Yet everything felt arranged, as if the inhabitants had just stepped away and never returned. I reached out to touch a doorframe, and the wood was soft, almost spongy, a reminder of how long it had been submerged. With each step, the ground beneath me felt less stable, more like it was eager to swallow me whole. And then I noticed something. The faint prints of footsteps, still fresh in the wet silt, leading further into the village. My heart began to pound faster as I followed them. Each footprint seemed to sink deeper than the last, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them was struggling to move. They led me to a narrow alleyway, where the shadows were thicker, clinging to the walls like a black fog. The air grew colder the deeper I went, my breath forming clouds that vanished into the gloom. It was there in the darkness that I heard it, a soft rustling, almost like fabric brushing against stone. I turned quickly, the sound coming from behind me, but there was nothing there, just the empty street and the outlines of half-submerged houses. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the rustling returned, closer this time, and accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing in the tight alley, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. I strained to see through the mist, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, expecting to see something emerge at any moment. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, replaced by an almost imperceptible whisper, soft guttural, words that I could not understand. They were faint, as if carried on the wind, yet they resonated within me, filling me with a deep, primal fear. As I moved forward, I saw something out of place. A door, slightly ajar, with a faint light flickering inside. The light danced like a candle flame, casting strange, shifting shapes on the waterlogged floor. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning loudly in protest. The room inside was small, its walls lined with shelves that held objects I couldn't immediately recognize. There was a smell, a damp, musty odor mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp. My eyes were drawn to the far corner, where a figure stood. At first, I thought it was just another trick of a light, a shadow cast by the flickering glow. But then it moved. Slowly, it turned towards me, and I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. It was featureless, smooth and pale, as if someone had taken a person and erased all their defining characteristics. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming from the figure itself. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The figure raised a hand, pointing towards me, its arm elongated unnaturally, the fingers impossibly thin and long. I tried to back away, my breath caught in my throat, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The light in the room flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, the figure vanished. I spun around, desperate to see where it had gone, but the room was empty. The only thing left was the silence, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me. I could still hear the whispering, though, echoing faintly in my ears, as if it had burrowed deep into my mind. I stumbled out of the house, my heart pounding, and as I stepped back into the alley, I saw them, more figures, standing in the mist, watching me. Their faceless heads turned in unison, their hollow presence filling me with a dread unlike anything I had ever known. Suddenly, the air shifted, thickening as if it had become a physical presence, something pressing in on me from all sides. The faceless figures stood silently in the mist, their featureless heads slowly tilting in my direction, and a deep sense of dread clawed at my insides. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but it felt as though invisible hands were holding me in place. The mist seemed to move with purpose, twisting around my ankles, rising higher until it was as if I was wading through the very essence of fear. The whispers returned, no longer faint, but loud and overlapping, a cacophony of voices pleading, cursing, demanding. As I struggled to breathe, I saw something glinting in the distance, a faint glow, like a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. It was coming from the center of the village, from what appeared to be an ancient fountain, half submerged and covered in moss. The light was an eerie, unnatural shade of blue, pulsing rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. I felt an inexplicable pull towards it, as if it was calling to me, urging me to uncover the secrets that lay within. Against all logic, against every instinct that screamed at me to flee, I moved towards a fountain, each step heavier than the last, as though the ground itself wanted to swallow me whole. When I reached the fountain, I saw it, an object resting in the shallow, murky water. It was a pendant, covered in algae, yet glowing with that strange, ethereal light. The whispers grew louder as I knelt to pick it up, my fingers trembling as they touched the cold, wet metal. The moment I made contact, a shock ran through me, freezing me in place. The world around me seemed to shift, the village dissolving into a blur of dark water and twisted shapes. The whispers turned into screams, piercing, anguish cries that filled my mind, drowning out every other thought. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was as if the pendant had fused with my skin, binding me to whatever force inhabited this forsaken place. And then I saw her, emerging from the shadows, her figure blurred by the mist, was the drowned woman. Her hair floated around her head like a dark halo, her hollow eyes fixed on me, empty yet filled with a silent accusation. She moved towards me, her feet not touching the ground, gliding over the water as if she were part of it. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst, my body frozen in terror as she came closer, her face inches from mine. Her mouth opened, and from within, a black, viscous liquid began to pour, dripping onto the pendant, onto my hands, cold as ice and reeking of rot. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was gone, stolen by the terror that gripped me. The drowned woman's empty eyes seemed to expand, filling my vision, pulling me into their endless darkness. The world around me disappeared, replaced by the sensation of being submerged, the cold water closing in, pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I was drowning, not in the lake, but in her, in the depths of her sorrow and rage. The pendant pulsed in my hand, its light flickering, growing dimmer as the darkness consumed me. In one final act of desperation, I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to escape this nightmare. I focused on the feeling of my heartbeat, the sensation of my breath, anything to remind myself that this wasn't real. The screams faded, replaced by an eerie silence, and I felt the weight on my chest lift, the cold water receding. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the village. I was in my room, drenched in sweat, my hands trembling as they clutched at the sheets. The clock on my bedside table read 3:33 a.m., the numbers glowing in the darkness like a mocking reminder. But something was wrong. The whispers, they hadn't stopped. Faint, almost imperceptible, they echoed in the corners of my room, a constant, maddening presence. And then I noticed it. The pendant, lying on my nightstand, its glow faint but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, the realization sinking in like a stone in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a dream. Whatever I had seen, whatever I had touched, had followed me back, and the nightmare was far from over. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and an unease that clung to me like a second skin. The whispers were always there, at the edge of my hearing, a constant reminder that the nightmare was not just a figment of my imagination. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the drowned woman, her hollow eyes staring into me, and feel the weight of that pendant, cold and relentless. It sat on my nightstand, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Something about it felt alive, as though it was watching me, waiting for something. I needed answers. My curiosity, mixed with fear, drove me to start researching. I scoured old maps, historical records, anything that might provide a clue. The name of the village came to me in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that slowly began to fit together. It was called Brackmore, a settlement that had been abandoned and flooded years ago after a dam was built upstream. The stories I found were vague, but there were whispers, just like the ones I heard, of strange occurrences, of people going missing, of voices heard at the edge of the water. It was as if the lake itself held a grudge, a hatred for those who had forgotten the lives swallowed by its depths. I visited the town closest to where Brackmore had once been. The locals were reluctant to speak about it, their eyes narrowing when I mentioned the name. It was as though the very memory of the place had been cursed, a wound that refused to heal. Eventually, I found an old man willing to talk. His voice was low, his gaze distant, as if recalling a memory he had long tried to bury. He spoke of the village, of how it had been submerged, and of the strange occurrences that followed. People seeing figures in the mist, hearing voices at night. His stories mirrored my dream in chilling detail, and with every word, the realization that this nightmare was real began to solidify in my mind. The old man mentioned something else, a symbol, one that the villagers had supposedly used in rituals before the flooding, an attempt to ward off whatever darkness had taken root there. He sketched it for me on a piece of paper, his hand trembling, and when I saw it, my blood ran cold. It was the same symbol I had seen in my dream, etched onto the walls, glowing faintly on the pendant. I tried to ask him more, but he stopped abruptly, his eyes widening with fear, and he refused to say another word. It was as if even speaking of it could draw its attention, could bring the curse back to him. I left the village with more questions than answers, the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on me. When I returned home, I found the pendant had moved. It was no longer on the nightstand, but resting on my pillow, as if waiting for me. My heart pounded as I approached it, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, the room seeming to darken around me, the shadows thickening until they felt almost alive. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal, and a shock of fear surged through me, images flashing in my mind, visions of the drowned village, of the figures standing silently in the mist, of the woman's hollow eyes. Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet, hoping to find others who had experienced something similar. It wasn't long before I found obscure forums, threads filled with people recounting their own encounters with the drowned village. They spoke of dreams, of a compulsion to return, of a feeling that something was watching them. One post in particular caught my attention. A man who claimed to have gone to Brackmore, just as I had, and brought something back. His words were frantic, filled with terror, and he spoke of the pendant, of how it seemed to move on its own, how the whispers had become louder, more insistent. His final message was a warning. Do not touch it. Do not listen to the voices. Once you bring it back, it never leaves. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the pendant. The whispers were louder than ever, and I could feel a presence, something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, always there, watching. I knew that whatever I had seen in the village had followed me, that it was connected to this object in a way I couldn't yet understand. The old man's words echoed in my mind, and I realized with a sinking dread that this was far from over. The nightmare had crossed over into my reality, and now it was only a matter of time before it consumed me entirely. The whispers wouldn't stop. They grew louder with each passing day, becoming a constant presence in my life, a maddening noise that seemed to seep into my thoughts, twisting them into something dark and foreign. I could no longer sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see the drowned woman, her face, her hollow eyes pulling me deeper into an abyss that I feared I could never escape. My once orderly life had fallen into chaos. Food tasted like ash, every shadow seemed to move, and the pendant's glow never dimmed, even in the brightest light of day. It was as if it thrived on my fear, feeding on the growing darkness within me. I knew I had to return to Brackmore. The realization filled me with dread, but there was also a pull, a compulsion I couldn't fight. I needed to confront whatever I had awakened, to find a way to sever the connection before it consumed me entirely. The drive to the lake felt surreal, the world outside the car seeming distant, as if I were traveling through a dream. The mist began to roll in as I neared the lake, thick and oppressive, wrapping around the trees like skeletal fingers. My breath quickened as the familiar, chilling atmosphere settled over me, and the whispers seemed to grow excited, like they knew I was getting closer to something they desired. When I arrived at the lake, the water was as dark and foreboding as it had been in my dreams. The mist hung low over the surface, obscuring the far shore, and an eerie silence enveloped everything. I made my way to the edge, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, standing by the water, was a figure, a man, old and weathered, with eyes that seemed haunted by the same darkness that now followed me. It was Elias, the fisherman the locals had mentioned, the one who had lived near the lake all his life. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear, as if he could see the shadows that clung to me. Elias spoke in a hushed tone, barely above a whisper, warning me of the dangers of what lay beneath the lake. He told me stories of others who had been drawn here, of those who had touched the pendant and had never been the same again. He spoke of voices that lured people into the water, of shadows that moved beneath the surface, and of the drowned who walked the shore at night, seeking something they had lost. His words were chilling, each one sinking deep into my soul, confirming my worst fears. I was not the first, and I would not be the last, unless I found a way to break free. Determined, I asked Elias to take me out onto the lake to where the village lay submerged. He hesitated, fear etched into every line of his face, but eventually he agreed. As we pushed the small boat into the water, the whispers became almost deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping, urging me forward. The lake was eerily still, the mist swirling around us, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The further we went, the colder the air became, and a sense of dread settled over me, pressing down like a weight on my chest. Elias rowed silently, his eyes darting nervously around, as if expecting something to emerge from the water at any moment. When we reached the center of the lake, the place where I had seen the fountain in my dreams, Elias stopped. The water was dark, almost black, and I could see the faint outlines of rooftops beneath the surface, their shapes distorted and ghostly. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the pendant. It pulsed in my grip, its light flickering, and the whispers grew more frantic, more demanding. I knew I had to do something to end this nightmare, but I didn't know how. The pendant seemed to have a life of its own, resisting my attempts to throw it into the water, the metal growing colder and heavier with each passing moment. Suddenly, the boat rocked, and I looked up to see figures emerging from the mist. The drowned, pale, featureless, their hollow eyes fixed on me, stood at the edge of the water, their bodies swaying as if caught in an unseen current. Elias gasped, his face going white, and he whispered a prayer under his breath, his hands trembling on the oars. The figures began to move towards us, their feet not touching the water, gliding silently across the surface. My heart pounded in my chest, panic surging through me as they drew closer, their empty eyes seeming to pierce into my very soul. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. The pendant was a link, a bridge between me and the darkness that had taken hold of Brackmore. I had to break that connection, to sever whatever bond had formed the night I found it. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I gripped the pendant tightly, feeling its cold weight against my palm, and plunged it into the water. The effect was immediate. The whispers turned into screams, a piercing, agonized wail that filled the air, and the figures halted, their forms flickering, becoming less solid. The water beneath us began to churn, dark shapes moving beneath the surface, and for a moment, I thought I saw her, the drowned woman, her eyes fixed on me, her face twisted in a look of rage and sorrow. The boat rocked violently, the water splashing over the sides, and I felt something wrap around my ankle, pulling me towards the edge. I looked at Elias, his face a mask of terror, and he shouted something, his voice lost in the chaos. I fought against the pull, my heart pounding, and with one final effort, I tore the pendant from my neck, hurling it into the depths. The world seemed still. The water grew calm, the figures began to fade, and the whispers, for the first time in days, stopped. The silence was deafening, the sudden absence of noise almost overwhelming. I collapsed into the boat, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and Elias quickly began to row us back to shore, his eyes wide, his face pale. As we reached the edge of the lake, I looked back, and for a moment I saw her, standing at the center of the water, her form barely visible through the mist, her eyes still watching me, a silent promise that this was far from over. The silence that had once brought me relief now felt like an omen, a prelude to something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. The pendant was gone, but the whispers still echoed in my dreams, and the image of the drowned woman remained vivid in my mind. Every night, I found myself back in the lake, submerged, gasping for air as her empty eyes drew closer, her fingers cold and skeletal, brushing against my skin. It was as if she was trying to pull me back, refusing to let me go, even after I had severed the connection. It became clear that whatever I had unleashed had not been vanquished. It was merely waiting, and the time was running out. One evening, I received an anonymous package on my doorstep. Inside was an old, weathered book, bound in cracked leather and covered in symbols that mirrored those I had seen in the village. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with drawings of rituals, strange diagrams, and notes written in a language I couldn't understand. But among the pages, one stood out, a detailed sketch of the pendant, with instructions, written in a shaky hand, on how to complete the severance ritual. My heart pounded as I read the words, the dread sinking in as I realized what I had to do. I had to go back to the lake, to confront the drowned woman one last time, to end it where it had begun. I returned to the lake under the cover of night, the full moon casting an eerie glow over the water. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around me as if it had a life of its own, and the air was heavy with a sense of anticipation, as though the lake itself knew what was coming. In my hands, I held the book, its weight feeling far heavier than the pages it contained. I knew this was the final confrontation, the moment that would decide whether I could rid myself of the darkness that had haunted me, or if it would drag me under forever. I stepped into a small boat, pushing off from the shore, my eyes fixed on the center of the lake. The whispers returned almost immediately, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to rise from the depths, growing louder with each stroke of the oars. The water was dark and still, reflecting the moonlight in patches, but beneath the surface, I could see shapes shifting, moving in unnatural ways. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the center of the lake, the spot where the pendant had disappeared. The air was freezing, my breath visible in the dim light, and the whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices overlapping, speaking words that chilled me to the core. I opened the book, my hands trembling as I began to read the words of the ritual, the language foreign, the syllables strange and harsh. The wind picked up, the mist swirling faster, and the whispers grew more frantic, almost as if they were trying to drown out my voice. I could feel the presence of the drowned woman, her eyes watching me from the shadows, her rage palpable, a cold hand resting on my shoulder, though nothing was there. The boat rocked, the water rippling around me, and then I saw her, rising from the depths, her form slowly emerging, her hair floating around her face, her eyes fixed on me with a hollow, endless stare. My voice wavered as I continued the incantation, the words barely audible over the growing noise. She moved closer, her body gliding over the surface of the water, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out, only the endless echo of the whispers. The book in my hands began to glow faintly, the symbols on the page shimmering, and I felt a strange heat spread through my body, a force pushing against the darkness, resisting the pull of the drowned woman. She reached out, her fingers impossibly long, dripping with dark water, and I knew that if she touched me, it would be over, that I would be lost to the lake, just like the others before me. With a final surge of desperation, I shouted the last word of the ritual, my voice breaking, and the pendant burst forth from the water, glowing brightly, blinding in the darkness. The drowned woman let out a silent scream, her form distorting, the water around her churning violently. The light from the pendant grew brighter, enveloping her, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of sadness, of something lost that could never be found. Then, she was gone, her body dissolving into mist, the whispers fading into silence, and the pendant fell back into the water, the glow extinguished. The lake grew still, the mist slowly receding, and I collapsed into the boat, my body shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The book slipped from my hands, the pages now blank, as if the ritual had erased everything it contained. The air was quiet, the oppressive weight lifting, and for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, there was peace. I looked around, the moonlight reflecting off the calm surface of the lake, and I knew that it was over, that the connection had been severed and the drowned woman was gone. But as I began to row back to shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching from beneath the surface, waiting. The lake was quiet, but the darkness remained, and I knew that while I had escaped, the village would always be there, submerged and forgotten, a place where the drowned whispered, where the past refused to stay buried. And as I reached the shore, stepping onto solid ground, I couldn't help but glance back, my eyes scanning the water, half expecting to see her once again, standing silently, her eyes hollow, her presence a reminder that some nightmares never truly end. The days that followed my return from Brackmore were strangely quiet, almost unnaturally so. The whispers had ceased, and for the first time in weeks, I was able to sleep without the image of the drowned woman haunting my dreams. But something about the silence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm, a deceptive peace hiding a far greater terror. Despite my attempts to move on, the memory of that night lingered, etched into my mind. The glow of the pendant, the hollow look in her eyes before she vanished. These images refused to leave me, hovering like a dark cloud over every moment of my waking life. I tried to convince myself that it was truly over, that the ritual had worked and the nightmare had ended. Yet, strange things began to happen. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving where there should be none, reflections in mirrors that didn't belong to me. My house grew colder, an unnatural chill that settled deep into the bones. Regardless of how high I turned up the heat, it felt like something had followed me back. Not the whispers, not the drowned woman herself, but a remnant, an echo of the darkness that had taken root in the depths of the lake. The sense of being watched had returned, an unseen presence that made my skin crawl and my heart race whenever I found myself alone. One night, as I lay in bed, I was awakened by a sound, a soft dripping, rhythmic and persistent, echoing through the silence of the room. My heart froze, the memory of that same dripping sound from the village returning with terrifying clarity. Slowly, I got up, my breath catching in my throat as I followed the sound down the hallway, each step taking me closer to an impossible truth I wasn't ready to face. The dripping led me to the bathroom, the door slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, my hand trembling as I did. There, in the dim light, I saw it, the sink filled with dark water, the surface rippling as if something had just moved beneath it. I stepped closer, my reflection barely visible in the murky water, distorted and unfamiliar. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The water began to swirl, slowly at first, then faster, forming a whirlpool, and in its depths, I saw her, her face, pale and hollow, staring up at me. Her mouth moved, the same silent scream I had seen before, her eyes filled with an endless sorrow that seemed to reach out and grip my very soul. I stumbled backward, my hand knocking over a glass on the counter, the sharp sound shattering the silence. But when I looked back, the water was clear, the vision gone, as if it had never been there. Desperation began to set in. I knew that whatever I had done, whatever ritual I had performed, it wasn't enough. The pendant was gone, but its connection to me remained, a thread that tied me to the drowned village, to the darkness that refused to let go. I started to search for more answers, scouring the old bookshops, speaking to those who might know more, but every lead ended in dead ends, every answer only deepened the mystery. It was as if the village itself was protecting its secrets, ensuring that no one would ever understand the full extent of what lay beneath those dark waters. Then I received a message, an email from an address I didn't recognize, containing only a single line. The lake never forgets. Attached to the email was a photograph, a blurred, grainy image of a lake at night, the mist hanging low over the water, and there, in the center, was a figure, barely visible, standing silently, watching. My blood ran cold, my heart skipping a beat as I recognized her. The drowned woman, her form unmistakable even through the fog and darkness. It was a warning, a reminder that whatever had started in Brackmore was far from over. The nightmare had crossed over into my reality, and now it was part of my life, an ever-present shadow that would never truly leave. The last thing I remember from that night was the sound of water, loud, rushing water, as if a wave was crashing down upon me, and then everything went dark. When I woke, I was in a hospital, the sterile white lights blinding, the beeping of monitors echoing in my ears. The doctors said I had been found unconscious in my home, no signs of injury, no explanation for what had happened. But I knew, deep down, I knew that the lake had claimed a part of me, that the drowned woman had left her mark, and that the nightmare was far from over. And now, I share this story with you, not for sympathy, not for answers, but as a warning. Brackmore is real, and it is still out there, waiting beneath the mist, its secrets buried in the dark waters. If you ever find yourself near the lake, if you ever hear the whispers calling you, turn away. Do not listen. Do not follow. Because once you are marked, once you touch the darkness, it never truly lets go. Do you believe it's truly over? Or is it only the beginning of something far more sinister? The drowned woman still appears, her hollow gaze a reminder that the past does not forget. Why does the symbol keep appearing, even now? Is there something more to this story that I've yet to uncover? If you feel as though the shadows sometimes linger too long or the whispers seem just a little too real, share your story in the comments. And if you want to join me as I continue to uncover these dark truths, subscribe, leave your theories below, and remember, sometimes nightmares don't end when we wake up. And the lake, well, it might just be waiting for you too.